Hi, BookTube. Welcome to a non-fiction review, and in a way, this is my answer to a question on the Am I a Book Snob tag that I failed to reply to because I didn't take any notes with me to Hey on Why. But I think there was a question to the effect of, have you ever lied and said that you've read a book that you hadn't actually read? I can't think that I've ever done that. However, when it comes to this particular book and this particular subject matter, I can think of situations where before I'd read the book, I would desperately want to lie and say that I knew all about this subject. Today, we're reviewing Harriet Tubman, The Road to Freedom, written by Catherine Clinton, published in 2004. It was a copy that I purchased in December 2024, and I did it from shame. Yes, shame. There's no, let's just get straight to the truth. I was listening to a podcast. It was a discussion group, and one of them said something to the effect of, and of course we all know about Harriet Tubman's achievements in this area. And I think it was referring to what she'd done during the American Civil War. And I had no idea. And I knew that if I was in that panel discussion, my body language, if I didn't watch myself, would betray the fact that I had absolutely no idea. And I was not taught. Canadian high school history doesn't cover United States history, oddly. But it doesn't. So I never learned about Harriet Tubman in school. And in Britain, I suppose the emphasis tends to be a little bit more on British history. So I filled in a lot of my gaps in British history, but I have a lot of, they're more than gaps. They're kind of yawning chasms in American history, and I have to catch up. And I thought, okay, can't do everything all at once, but I felt that a simple biography would help me plug the gap in my knowledge about Harriet Tubman. Regarding the author, Catherine Clinton was born in Kansas City, Missouri. She was a Harvard graduate from 1973, where she studied sociology and African American history. And she is currently Denman Professor of American History at the University of Texas in San Antonio. And of course, I've given a link to her website there on my author information. I'll also make sure that's in the description box. I didn't choose Catherine Clinton specifically. I didn't seek her out. In fact, really what I did, this is how elementary it was. I typed Harriet Tubman into amazon.co.uk, and then I surveyed the list of books that came up, because there are a lot of books written about her. Many of them seem to me to be aimed at an audience that was at high school or lower in elementary school grades. And I thought, great, look at all those books for kids. That's fantastic. Too bad I never saw one of those when I was growing up. But this one seemed to be one of the most promoted biographies. Doesn't mean it's the best, but there you go. I couldn't be fussy. When you're totally ignorant, you really do need to just grab the first piece of adult work you can. And I will say this, it's a very straightforwardly written piece of work, and I'm going to read you a sample so you'll get a sense of that. So it would be, I say, excellent place for a complete, like me, someone that's ashamed to realize that they've heard the name Harriet Tubman, they associate it with the Underground Railroad, but don't know why they do. That's how thin on the ground my knowledge was. I love it that I've got back to all these tables and little slides, because they give you so much information at one glance. So this tells you about the structure of the book overall. There is a 5-page introduction. We've got 13 chapters, and they average about 16 pages per chapter. And I'm going to talk about reading on the Kindle app. Some people are absolutely opposed to reading ebooks, and I'm not going to make a case like, oh, you must. But the advantage of reading, particularly nonfiction on the Kindle or Kindle app, is that you can search the text very easily, make annotations and notes that are easy to search as well without actually flipping through the book. There is a search facility. But I think also the advantage of reading on the Kindle or the Kindle app is that the reader can choose the text font, the size of that font, the line spacing between lines, the page width, and the color and the brightness of the page. Now, that's something that with a paperback book, you're kind of stuck. If you pick up a book and it turns out to be small typeface, very dense on the page, not a lot of space for annotations, well, that's what you get. And I think the lovely thing about the Kindle or the Kindle app is that you can adjust the text to be something really comfortable for you personally to read. And of course, as people's eyesight changes, as mine does, I find that if you want to read at night, that amazingly, I think the Kindle app, because you can adjust it, you worry less about eye strain. Even though you might be thinking, yes, but what about all that blue light? Again, you can filter that out. You can recolor the screen so it comes across as warm light. And I haven't found that I've had any difficulty with that. But that's an aside. Let's go back to the book. I want to talk about the resources that are in it. There aren't a great deal of resources. There are no illustrations, and there are plenty online. And basically, they're the few photographs that were taken of Harriet Tubman. Maps. Now, this is something I really feel the book needed, or at least, if possible, I know that there's a lot of speculation, and I will get to that later on in this review. There's a lot of speculation about exactly how and where Harriet Tubman moved around the United States when she was freeing slaves and as she was taking them north. But even so, some maps that chart the possible journeys that she might have taken would have helped for those of us who perhaps aren't familiar with the geography around Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania. That's a very interesting piece of United States geography. I went onto Google Maps and I thought, oh, wow, as you realize all the small islands and inlets and the rivers and the waterways there, it's quite an interesting piece of geography, and to navigate it on foot, it'd be interesting to sort of see what route Harriet Tubman and those that she saved took to go north. I would just have been interested in that myself. Really, all you get in addition to the text itself is a page of acknowledgements, a bibliography, and some notes, and they're all at the back of the book rather than footnotes in the text. If you're concerned about that, if you prefer footnotes in the text, then perhaps check and see if there's another biography that lays out its information that way. Regarding style, I think the best way to give you a sense of style is always to read a section from the text. So I am, just to show you how straightforward this particular book is to read. And I'm reading now from chapter 2. Once freed, Araminta decided to take a new first name, Harriet. This was the name of her mother, and may also have been the name of one of her sisters who disappeared in the South. Perhaps as a sign of her continued devotion to her husband, she kept his last name. When Araminta escaped the hell of slavery for the heaven of liberty, she had crossed the line of which she had so long been dreaming, and was reborn as Harriet. Her escape was remarkable. For one thing, the overwhelming majority of successful fugitives were men, but here was a girl in her 20s, venturing out of her home counties for the first time, hoping to make it to freedom on her own. That she made this treacherous and unknown journey shows the nerve and resourcefulness that would become her trademark. That first time, out in the open, Tubman must have dreaded the baying of bloodhounds signaling a posse in pursuit. Would she have known to rub asafoetida, a foul-smelling herb, on her feet to elude tracking dogs? She knew to follow the North Star, but what if clouds filled the autumn night sky? It must have been a terrifying experience for her, leaving behind loved ones and familiar terrain. In her later years, Tubman shared stories about her escape with Sarah Bradford, the reformer in Geneva, New York, who wrote an authorized biography in 1869. Bradford's account suggests that Tubman had wanted to run away for several years, but when she confronted the practicalities of an escape with few resources and no guide, she was rightly hesitant. You will see just how many qualifying words there are. I've put them in red font. May, perhaps, must have, would she have known, it must have been, suggests, all these qualifiers the author is using. And you may find, as I did, that initially they were a very strange thing to encounter in a biography. So many guesses, estimates, possibilities laid out, questions asked, did this happen? Could this have happened? Rather than just the dispensing of facts. Having just finished George Eliot's biography, which is just crammed full of recorded facts, this was an interesting book to read because it is more full of suggestions and possibilities than recorded facts. And I think that's the challenge that any Tubman biographer will have, and that's lack of sources. Catherine Clinton's book devotes a considerable amount of its page space to speculations, or when it runs out of things it can speculate about, Clinton will stop and give you a general history of a particular facet of slave ownership, or the Underground Railroad, or what escaped fugitive blacks did when they crossed the border into Canada, where they settled and what they did. She might give you sections on that, which seem to be diverting a little bit from the biography. But she really doesn't have any choice. Let's give an example. Chapter 1. Clinton talks about Tubman's early years and her parents. And there's considerable speculation there because we don't know Tubman's date of birth, and little can be said for certain about her family line before her parents, or about how many other children her parents had. So the chapter also takes a little time to trace the growth and development of slave trading and acquisition on farms throughout, from the 16th century, I'd say, through to the early 19th. And so you might find you have to manage, I guess, a little frustration. But it's a frustration that I think is a good learning experience, because in other aspects of history, you will get more data put down. And this is where I didn't record this in my last video, but I was mentioning about the Tubman biography and using that well-known maxim, and I don't know who first said it, history is written by the victors. And because of that, and I'm going to go into a rabbit hole on this book, because of that, we don't have the information that would be good to have to really get down to the details of Harriet Tubman's life and her achievements. I'll also give you a quick summary of the contents of each chapter. Chapter 1, Born into Bondage, gives you Harriet's early childhood and some background on her parents and the family which owned them, and how they treated Harriet and her mother and father and Harriet's siblings, as much as we know about them. And in addition to that, in the same chapter, you get a general history of the expansion of slave ownership across the American Eastern Seaboard from about 1600 through to 1800. Chapter 2 is called Coming of Age in the Land of Egypt, and that's about Tubman's young adulthood, her marriage, and her decision to escape. Chapter 3, Crossing Over into Freedom, is the account, as much as we know about it, and it isn't much, there's a lot of speculation here, on how Harriet escaped from Bucktown, Maryland, up to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And then there's general comments as well on the dangers of escape and recapture. Again, that's another one of those diversions, because there isn't a great deal of information about exactly how did Harriet get across country on foot. Chapter 4, In a Free State, comments on just how tenuous that freedom was of escaped Black Americans who came up over the boundary line into Pennsylvania and were living in Philadelphia. And then Clinton takes some time to talk about the Bloodhound Law and the Fugitive Slave Law, which really allowed slave owners to cross over the border into Pennsylvania and recapture what they considered to be their property. That freedom wasn't really freedom. That there was still always the fear of recapture. And for this reason, the next chapter, chapter 6 and chapter 7, The Moses of Her People and Canadian Exile, when it's talking about Tubman's attempts to cross back into Maryland and bring other people, her family sometimes, or just people that she knew or people she was referred to or told about, bring them also across into the Free States but how very often she took them further than that. She took them across the 49th parallel into Canada to St. Catharines, Ontario, where a community began to grow up. And she talks a little bit about that community in Canada and some of the issues with racism when the escaped Black Americans were living in St. Catharines. And that I found interesting as well. Chapters 8 and 9, Trouble in Canaan and Crossroads at Harper's Ferry, they're discussing again more of Tubman's journeys, the number of these that she made. She virtually made a journey I think she tended to make them in winter because the nights were longer and most of her traveling was done at night. I may be getting that wrong. Or did she winter in Canada? Wintering in Canada is a good idea because nobody's gonna trouble themselves to come after you in the winter in Canada. It may be that I think she did her journeys down south in the summers, and then after that she would winter in Canada because she had to be concerned about maintaining her own freedom in order to continue to do the work she did. She became notorious and well known as she achieved more and more successful, rescues of people from slavery. And the chapters which were particularly helpful to me, from 10 through to 12 at the end, Arise, Brethren, Bittersweet, Victories, and Final Battles, were talking about the role that Harriet Tubman played during the American Civil War, which I had no idea. I didn't realize she participated at all. And of course, she did effectively espionage work for the Union side. Because she was so good at crossing country on foot and remaining unseen, what she would do, I think she was put in charge of small parties of soldiers, and she would lead them, and they would do a reconnaissance mission to get closer to the Confederate troops to see where are they camped, how well are they armed, does it look as though they're ready to fight, or where are they perhaps expecting an attack to come from? And then she would go back and advise the Union commanders as to how they should best, what's the word I'm looking for? What would their best strategies be? On the basis of her information, they formed their battle strategies. And so she was key to some of the victories that they achieved. She also did a lot of nursing work. She opened a laundry. She did a lot of different things. All of this was unpaid work, by the way. And I don't know how she did it. How she managed to just subsist while she did all these different things amazes me. And she was a woman of very strong religious faith. And that's one of the reasons I chose the thumbnail that I did, is that I felt that she spent a lot of time having to ask for help, having to pray, because she was in some very desperate and dangerous situations. And yet she always found a way through it. And there are many legends that have grown up around that. And of course, you can never be sure how much truth is in them. But given the amount of dangerous work she did, and the fact that she lived to the age she did and maintained her freedom and maintained freedom for a lot of other people, suggests that she, for as far as she was concerned, a lot of those prayers did get answered. Rabbit hole. I want to talk about history, both personal history and cultural and national history. And I'm going to use me as an example because I'm a good example in the sense that I've got a very rich personal and family history. On my father's side of the family, my maternal grandmother's surname is Locke. That can be spelt with or without an E at the end, and sometimes it can be spelt without a C. It can be L-O-K rather than L-O-C-K. And that family, I have a cousin who's been able to take the Locke family back to the 16th century in England. Now, we do not know who we might be related to. You might think of a famous Locke right away, John Locke, the English philosopher who was based in London. And we haven't found a link, exactly, a proven link to John Locke. But we do know that there were a group, a family of Lockes who were from Surrey and lived in London, who also then branched out, and they had relations who lived in Devon and Somerset. And that is where my family hails from, my Locke family hails from. Certainly, I know from having gone down to Devon that my family were wealthy. The Locke ancestors had a bit of money because they could afford to entomb themselves in the walls of the town churches. And I thought, no, that wasn't for just anybody. So it's a family that can be traced back because they were wealthy and had titles. So the Locke family goes back a long way. Now, however, there are indications that the earliest Englishman to bring Black Africans from their home in Ghana to England was a man named John Locke. Now, whether he continued to trade, I gather he brought these initial 5 across to train as guides or navigators. I don't know how true that is. I take that with a grain of salt until I see some proof. But it wasn't long after that other men followed through, and that may have been on his instigation because he might have said, there's more of these for sale. You can buy people and, do what you like with them. And so perhaps he was instrumental in beginning the slave trade. But I say this because having that personal history and being English and having all that cultural and national history behind is, you don't think about it. It's something that can be completely taken for granted because you don't know what it feels like not to have it, to have a blank, to reach a dead end. But a lot of people, when they're doing their family history, do, and particularly if they are non-white, or they have a non-white person in their family lineage, and there's slavery, and slavery comes into their family experience, you can only go back so far, and then it simply ends. And that is something I don't think we think about. This biography, with its having to rely so much on speculation, it does because so many secrets had to be kept. In order to maintain that tenuous freedom, people had to not talk to anyone. I don't know who they ever trusted their stories with, because it would have been so dangerous. And it struck me that there are 3 ways in which we have deprived Africans of their history when we established the colonial slave trade and brought people across the Atlantic Ocean against their will. I mean, firstly, we removed them initially from the people and the geography that they had been part of for millennia. And I know that is something that matters to me. To be in the geography of England matters, and it's meaningful. And to be away from that, to be taken away from that, it's a big severance. It means you cannot continue to partake of the culture that you grew up with. As that culture grows and is added to, you have no part in it. So that gets cut off. But secondly, once we brought Africans across to North America and we were holding them as captives, we treated them as commodities. We bought and sold them, and we bought and sold them without regard to family relationships. So Harriet Tubman had several of her siblings sold off and sent to other states. Parents were never able to see their children again. Children never able to see their parents. Fathers separated from their wives, and so on. We split families up. That also cuts people off from their own history. So that's more history that is taken away. And then thirdly, because we held on to this delusion that the Africans we brought over could be treated as commodities and were not human beings, any expressions from those people which prove that they were, yes, human beings, that is, their desire for freedom, their desire to learn, to create, to build something that would benefit themselves, to set up something for their posterity. Anytime we saw that, and I say this as we, European and North American whites, felt threatened, and we often then tried to dismantle those opportunities to create, to learn, to build something. And so those expressions, which would have been the building blocks of culture had all these people been left to do what they wanted and were capable of doing, there would have been more culture and therefore more history built up. So I feel it's worth mentioning here in the context of Harriet Tubman's biography. Yes, it's sparse. And the reason it's sparse is because of those 3 different ways that we have robbed Africans of their history by bringing such a large group of them across against their will across an ocean, then holding them captive. And then even when we emancipated them, and I almost want to put that in air quotes, even when they were emancipated, we didn't quite want to fully bring them with us and treat them as fellow human beings. We somehow wanted there still to be a difference. And in wanting there to be a difference, we were dismantling their abilities and their attempts to make their own history and make their own culture. So it goes without saying that I'm really glad to have taken on board at least that much history. I can see that there's so many gaps. I need to read more about the Underground Railroad. What I would really like to read about, and I struggled to find any decent non-academic books on this subject, the Black Americans who fled across the 49th parallel into Canada. There were two, I suppose what we could say, two main groups. There was the group that went up into St. Catharines that were led there by Harriet Tubman herself, but there was also a group that crossed the border during the War of 1812 and settled in Nova Scotia around the city of Halifax. And they developed a neighborhood that they called Africville. Now, Africville existed in the neighborhood of Halifax. Halifax gradually grew until Africville became a suburb, but it was never offered the amenities or the services or the utilities of other neighborhoods in Halifax. And so it existed as a slum. And the Halifax authorities, and I'm going to say this because this happened the year I was born, on the 2nd of January, 1964, they took a decision that they were going to bulldoze down that entire neighborhood. Now, I have no idea what happened to the residents. The residents were slowly cleared out of there, whether they wanted to go or not, whether they had any place to go or not. And Africville simply disappeared. By the 1970s, it was completely torn down and no longer there. And no one ever spoke about this. I don't remember hearing it on the news. It was just another one of those things that as a Canadian growing up, I never got to hear about, along with residential schools for Indigenous Canadians, for First Nations children. Never heard about that. Never heard that the Canadians also imprisoned Japanese citizens during the Second World War. Never knew that. So there's a lot of racism in Canada that isn't well documented. I think now residential schools, we're getting to know more. We're allowing people to tell their stories. But I don't see a lot of stories being told by Canadian non-white citizens about how they were treated, Japanese and Black. And I think those stories need to be told. I see a few books out, but I don't see some really best-selling comprehensive works that put it out there for the general public and say you need to be aware of these stories. So I'm going to keep looking, and probably I will buy something. If I have to buy an academic book, I will, in order to get the facts. But to be truthful, I would rather have something that was written by one of a descendant of one of the residents of Africville. So I'm going to look out for a book like that to read later. Anyway, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this review. And I'm going to get ready now for a fiction review this coming Sunday. I had to think about what comes up at the weekend. Saturdays and Sundays. Yes. I've just finished reading a Doris Lessing. That's only the third Doris Lessing that I've read. So it's pretty unusual for me to read more than one book by the same author, but I do enjoy Lessing's work. I've finished reading a volume of her short stories. And so I'm going to be reviewing those for you in a few days' time. Until then, the sun is still out, so my plan for the rest of the day is to take my books outside and read like crazy. I hope your reading's going well this month, and I'll see you again soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.